on the iPad, break it down into steps that are way easier to follow than you might imagine, so that you can have a go and amaze yourself. Okay, welcome to another tutorial. As I explained in the intro, I'm going to break this down into steps so that you'll learn about the painting techniques and process, as well as the app that I'm using, Procreate. But that isn't to say that you couldn't use a different app on a different tablet and still follow along. But within the app, Procreate, I'm using their default A4 canvas, which is 297 by 210 millimeters at 300 dpi. And then in terms of the color profile, I'm using one of their default codes, which is the sRGB, and it's the code that ends in 2.1. In terms of the brushes, I'm going to try and keep it as simple as I possibly can for quite a complex looking landscape. I'm going to go within airbrushing and use the soft brush. I'm going to use the medium brush and possibly the medium hard brush. Within inking, I might use the Studio pen. Within artistic, I might use a version of the Aurora brush, which I'll amend and show you how I've amended it as we get to that point. Within elements, I might use the clouds brush. And within organic, I'll use a version of the rainforest brush too. Again, I'm going to amend that and explain it at the point at which I'm using it. In terms of the colors, you can see here, I've already pre-selected a color palette. Quite a lot of different subtle shifts in colours here that I'm going to use. Each of these colours, if you go to the value section, has what we call a hexadecimal code that is associated with it. And each of these codes is down in the video description, so if you need to copy and paste it into this box and press enter, but there's lots of colours, so it might take you some time. So if you look down in the video description, next to the codes is a link that takes you to my Patreon page, where you can download the colour file for free to save you some time. And of course, Patreon is the place that you can go and support this channel, help me to continue creating this free content here, but it's also where you can gain access to exclusive extended versions of these tutorials and other things. And with all of that said and done, we're going to get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to my colors. I'm going to select the first color on the top row. I'm going to drag from that color in the corner into the canvas and just flood fill the whole canvas. Then we're going to go to our layers. We're going to create a new layer, layer 2. With our brushes, we're going to go to airbrushing, soft brush. We're going to choose the second color on the top row. And if I show you that on the color disc, you can see it's gone to a really nice light blue. We're going to put the brush size at maybe 30%, 100% opacity. And then we're just going to do a band of that straight through the center of the canvas. Then we're going to go to the adjustment tools, the Gaussian blur, and we're going to blur that in to about the 70%. Deselect. I'm then going to create a new layer, layer 3. And on this layer, I'm going to use the Elements Clouds brush. I'm going to go to the third color on the top row. I'm going to put the brush size at around 8% and not quite 100%, so maybe a little bit back from there, about 80%. And then just a little bit up from halfway, I'm going to start doing some circles that all connect together. Now I want to create a slight kind of undulation of shapes. So I want some bits that dip down, some smaller shapes, some bigger shapes, but just generally a little bit of movement up and down just to create a variety of different shapes. And then it doesn't matter if we extend that further down. We're just looking for that top edge, really. And then in the center area, it doesn't really matter. We're going to have a big mountain that obstructs, cuts in front. So we're just, again, we'll see it re-emerge on this side. Maybe a couple of bigger round shapes that all just connect together nicely. And then again, we can just join it all together quite freely, like so. Stay on the same layer. I'm going to go to the fourth color. I'm going to turn the size of the brush down to about 3% and maybe the opacity down to about 50. And then just in here, I'm going to start bringing in some lighter colors, especially around that top edge. Now the light is going to be coming from quite high up. It's quite high in the sky. So we've not got a sunset or a sunrise situation. We've got light coming from above. So we're going to have the top edge kissed by the sunlight. Therefore we need to just represent that sunlight, certainly along that top edge. But we zoom in, we can also represent it as other shapes. Now it's typically this kind of a shape that we're going for, slightly over stylized, but that's fine. We just do a series of these kind of shapes. So maybe some shapes cut in front of others, for example. And we just allow these areas to build up. Not something I'm going to spend terribly long on, but just some semblance of these kind of forms. Then I'm going to put it back up to the 8%. And maybe just in this bottom area, I'm just going to circle in more broadly a bit more of this texture. So it just creates a bit more chaos, but some of those lines and shapes that we've put in there still remain, but they're not quite as stark a difference as it was initially. And then back down again to the 3% for the side. And again, we can just create light that just touches that top edge a little bit more. And then another shape that perhaps cuts in front. And your shapes will be different, and that's absolutely fine. So you just need to judge it a little bit based on what you have created and the positions of some of these forms. But roughly speaking, we're just going for the top edge. Doesn't have to be a thin line, however, though. Could be a bit of a block. Then we're going to put it back up to the 8. We've kept it at the 50% from before, even for the top edge, and that's fine. And then we can just start bringing in just a bit more of this lighter shade all the way around. I could even turn it back down again if I want to be more precise to the 3%. Just start adding a little bit more here and there as well. Some thicker bits of light near the top there. Now I'm going to go to that whole layer, go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and I'm going to blur it in 3%. Looks best, I think, just to soften it around the edges. It's not quite as crisp then. I think that can work a little bit better. And then we can go in with the smudge, set the smudge to the soft brush within airbrushing. We can put that up to about 3% and about 50% strength. And then certainly around the edges, we can just soften that in if we need to. Just have some of these blend out a little bit here and there. And that just again just helps create some sense that it's just softening in some particular areas, mushing together, and that can be really effective too. So you can use that as, you know, another way of continuing to draw. It's not so much adding, but it is pushing the pixels around, so it'd be really useful too. There we go. So nothing terribly complex about that stage. Yours probably will look a little bit different, and that's fine too. I'm going to create a new layer, layer 4. We're going to stick with the clouds brush. We're going to go to our colors, and we're going to use the, well, not quite the 5th color. We're going to move to the next color first, which is the 6th. We're going to put that at around 5% size and maybe about 80% opacity. And then we'll just start introducing perhaps a nearer to cloud formation. We can have this be quite substantial. Again, it could interplay with the clouds that we've already created. It's a little bit different. It is going to jut forward. Now maybe it's connected in some areas, but then there's big chunks of it that are just going to stick further forward, and that's absolutely fine. We can have some bits that just break away, formations of their own, little circles and dots or clumps. Join it in. Then we're going to switch colors back to the darkest color for this section, which is the 5th color. And we're just going to create a sense that there's some shadow areas now. So I'm going to add some dark tone. I'm not going to take it all the way up to the very edge. This is going to be kind of contained. It's also going to go down behind the mountain. It's going to be a very prominent feature. And almost down to the bottom edge, but definitely not all the way to the top edge. So we can just sort of scribble it in circular motions. Like so. Then on the same layer still, I'm going to go to the 7th color along. Now, this is going to be slightly warmer, but definitely lighter. So I'm going to turn it down to maybe 3% size. And then just around the top area, I'm going to have this intermingling a little bit with some of this darker tone. Doesn't need to be taken all the way to the very top edge, because we're going to use a lighter tone there. But it's almost like a step between. You can add it to various different areas. If you do take it higher up, it doesn't matter, because we're just going to go over it with lighter colors anyway. Maybe just introduce a little bit more of it down here. Again, everything's been added with squiggles, just really kind of a scribbling kind of motion throughout. Then I'm going to go to the next color, which is the 8th color. And then just a bit more considered now. I'm going to go around these shapes and I'm creating a top highlight similar to what we were doing before, but these are going to be even more distinct. So again, just around that top edge, you can trace it around. I'm going to have the sun predominantly coming from this side. So it's very much above, but it's coming from the left. And we're going to use that lighting for the mountain as well. So to keep the image consistent, we need to show that it is definitely coming from that side on the clouds, so that the clouds and the mountain clearly have the same light source. I'm going to emphasize the light just on this edge and then not here. Can have a few stray kind of edges here. So yes, we definitely want it around the top edge. We could have just a few peel back a little bit more towards the center as well. The clouds can be a little bit tricky. Don't worry too much if this stage is proving quite difficult for you. Don't give up on the tutorial, because once we add that as an element with the rest of the landscape, then you might find that you don't care as much about the clouds compared to how you feel about them now. So if they're not going quite how you want, you can always just keep going on the next steps of the landscape and then readdress these later and fine tune it if you need to. Okay, so just a couple of breakaway pieces, maybe they can bunch together as kind of streaks, as well as blobs. Just a variety of shapes here, maybe some lighter sections that just streak off, cut through. And then just bring some of the highlight down into that lower section just a little bit, so it kind of all melds together a little bit more. Maybe even bring it down into this section too. But I really want to sharpen the contrast here in this middle area. Now, just like we did before, we're going to go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur. We're going to blur that in. We did it 3% before, so we may as well stick with that. And then we'll go back to the smudge, make sure it's on the soft brush with an airbrushing. And again, maybe at 3% size, 50% opacity. Actually, let's do it a little bit smaller, just down into the 2. Be a little bit more controlled. And if you just want to smooth any areas in, if you feel there's just some areas that you're not happy with, and it's a good way of continuing to push it around, and it will just give a softer look for these transition points, and it might just help you get to the point where you're a little bit happier. Sometimes when I'm not quite happy with the quality of the brush marks somehow, then smudging it in just makes me feel a bit better about it. And certainly when it comes to things like these streaks that just cut through, we can use the smudge just to extend them, to push them through the areas a little bit more. That's quite effective. We might come back to the sky a little bit later, but we're going to push forward with the other elements, like I said. So we're going to go to our layers and create a new layer, layer 5. We're going to go to our brushes. We're going to go to the airbrushing. And we'll go for the medium brush this time. And then going back to our colors. We're not going to use these colors at the end for now. We're going to go to the first color on the middle row. And we're going to set the brush down to maybe 2% size and 100% opacity. And then I'm going to keep actually the mountain pretty much central here. So select the peak of the mountain, and then we can just bring it down. So we're creating those all important kind of peaks and then building in some slopes. You can bring it so far, and then you can have some little bumps and anomalies, more peaks. Another point, bring it down, however you feel happiest with this. And remember, it's on a separate layer, so if you want to continue to move this around and erase bits of it, it's not going to damage anything that you've already done for the clouds, so you can really fine tune this to the point that you're actually really happy with it. But just initially create some series of spikes, mountain peaks. You can peak in various different areas and then trail off. Then you can always put the brush size up, 5% size, and just fill. Once you get so far with it, you could just drag into the lower portion until it flood fills. Just slide it to the right, it will close up that little anomaly, and if it doesn't completely, we'll just colour over it. That isn't an issue. Now, I might further manipulate this, Now I can see it more clearly. Perhaps turn it back down again to the 2%. Just again, create some peaks. And then you could also go in with the eraser set to the medium brush with an airbrushing. In the same way we've added, we can also remove. Whoops, I've selected the smudge by accident. Let's go back. The medium brush with an airbrushing, 2% size, 100% opacity. That's better. Again, we can really fine tune this. You don't really want any overhangs too much, I suppose. So if you've got any things that just look like it would defy gravity too much, then just fix them up a little bit. And again, we can go to the transform, put it on freeform, and you can stretch it out, you can squash it down, you can bring it up. Now, I don't want it to be too far away from the top edge of the clouds. Perhaps I'll just move it this way a little bit. I want to see some of the clouds here, and I want to see some of the clouds there. Probably happier with it being positioned there, which means that I need to add more here, doesn't it? So back with my brush, bigger size, 100% opacity. I think that makes a bit more sense to me, like that. And like I say, you can further amend this later on. But for now, I'm going to go to the layer, tap on it, activate alpha lock. Then I'm going to go to the next color, which is the second color on the middle row. I'm going to go to the airbrushing soft brush. I'm going to put the brush size maybe at 20% and 100% opacity. And I'm just going to go for this lower section down here. Just do a band of it across. Then I can go to the adjustments, the Gaussian blur, and then I can blur that in to about the 50%. And all of that blurring of that band is contained within that original shape. Alpha lock can be really useful for just holding on to the outline, the outer edges of the form of that layer. Okay, we are going to go and create a new layer. I'm probably going to tick on that layer or tap on that layer and put on the clipping mask, which means it now links to the layer below. So if I go to a different color, for example, like the third color on the middle row, and I do a stripe of this, you'll notice it stops and it only applies it within the confines of the shape which it is linked to. So I'm going to go back to the medium brush with an airbrushing with this color, third color, lowest part 2% size and about 90% opacity. And I'm just going to go into this area. In fact, it needs to be even lower. So really the lowest part 2% just before it becomes 1. And then I don't need to worry around these edges because it won't go beyond the boundary. But I'm just going to start bringing in some shapes onto this side of the mountain peak. Now I'm going to keep them as broken forms. So importantly, I want some of these gaps to still remain. I'm just going to bring them down and we're adding some natural kind of rock color in here. Now within this area here, it is currently kind of featureless, but I'm going to add some more peaks, make this mountain look a little bit more interesting. But already it is kind of giving the impression that light is hitting the side of that mountain. It's a really quick, quite effective way to breathe life into our little mountain here. We can swing some of these textures down. And then within some of these areas, we can have another sweep that cuts up, another peak that you wouldn't see if it weren't for the light and shadow. So here's another peak. We won't see the other side of it just yet, but we can see it rises up. And then another one within here. Just some dashes and dots that kind of join together. Now I've got a general sweeping movement to go with the flow of this mountain area. And this helps kind of describe the direction. And then maybe just a few down here as well. Just this side of another peak. Now it won't make as much sense until we've got some more features in here. Maybe we can just subtly introduce it over here as well. And then probably we're going to get hints of it over here. There's large parts of this mountain and peaks that will probably be in the shadow of the mountain itself. So we don't need to add too much to these ones, for example. We'll go back to our colors. We'll go for the fifth color. And this color is going to be the snow that's on the opposite side. Now it needs to be toned back a bit, so probably about 50%. And then we're going to add some snow that's just settled on this side. And we're going to add brighter snow on the other side, but we'll start with this side first. This is not the same as the colour of the rock. The rock on this side, because it's in shadow, you won't really see it kind of highlighted particularly. Now you'll notice that I'm just leaving this section pretty much dark. It helps us just identify another peak. So I've gone up to the edge of it and then stopped around this section. And I'll do the same again. So we'll bring the snow over here, and then I'm just allowing this to remain as a way of picking out that little peak within the peak. So again, just some movement that goes with the flow of the mountain. You can imagine snow, and it collects and then it sweeps down. It's going to drag down in this kind of a movement anyway. So just understanding the direction is really quite important. And again, you can add some more little bits of snow into this side too. So we did preserve dark towards the top of that peak, but then as it comes lower down, you're going to start to see it coalesce into larger shapes again. And then it will form its own little snow slides coming down in this direction too. And again in here, maybe just, it's getting lower down, so you're going to see less and less of it perhaps. It's going to be warmer, so you get some smaller collections of it, but not quite as much. Maybe we could take it from over here and swing it up to various areas. Again, going up into the peaks. So you get that kind of a movement up into those shapes, just a little bit, not too much. And then bring it, sweep down a little bit in here because it looks a bit empty. Just a few hints of it over here. Again, you don't need to go overboard. As long as it's in this area, that's kind of where we need our eye to focus. Then we're going to have a clear shadow area here, so we're going to add some snow into here. Also, snow will tend to, depending on the movement of the sun, but if there's a side that will remain in shadow longer, then it will tend to cling onto the snow more as well. So it's normal for snow to be hanging out in the shadow parts of a mountain. We might go back to this colour. We'll stay on the same layer probably. So we'll go back a colour, we'll go to the fourth colour. And now we're going to add the highlighted snow for the light side. So in and amongst some of this rock, we're going to have snow too. So again, we need it on maybe even the 1% size, the top end of that, 80% opacity now. Then we can just bring some snow in and amongst the rock, just helping further define some of these shapes. You don't want to completely obliterate this rock colour though, so leave big sections perhaps where the snow hasn't really settled, and then other bits where it is just a little bit clearer. So in and amongst some of this, you can add the snow. But again, I wouldn't recommend too much. Like I was saying, perhaps on this side where it's getting more light throughout the day, although the sun will move, maybe it gets more light anyway, so we get slightly less snow. So just mix it in there a little bit. And the colours do most of the work for us, because when you zoom out, you know, it's just scribbles and dashes and dots and all these different things. Because the colours are set right, it's going to help create that effect for us really quite well. Now, yours will look different, and there's going to be variation in how successful these images look. It might be that yours looks amazing and it's way better than mine, and I can't wait to see that. Or it might be that you're not satisfied with it completely, and that's okay too. Don't be too hard on yourself. This, you know, is part of the process. But if you follow roughly what I'm saying, then you should be approaching something that should look halfway believable, especially when you zoom out and especially when you start adding in the other elements. Just like I was saying for the sky, I think now the sky starts to look better because we have another element added in the mix. And when we have the foreground elements, then the mountain as well will start to look even better too. Just add some snow in here. Then I'm going to go back again to the fifth colour, and then we're going to have some areas perhaps where the two bits of snow kind of join together, and then we can really see that they are the same element, just under different lighting conditions. So we can bring some snow down to mix and join with it, and then you really get a sense then that it's the same thing. Likewise here, you can just join up some of the snow, bring some of the snow down onto the other side so it spills over. Take some from here, and it's just about understanding what it is you're painting, what it is you're actually drawing, and what's going to make it work. Okay, so I'm going to go to the third colour again, and I'm going to go in with, what brush are we on? We're on the medium brush. I'll go back to the soft brush, 2% size, perhaps lower at about 40% opacity. And then I'm just going to start bringing in some bigger gestures and sweeps just to kind of start joining it in somewhat. You can see how it kind of binds it together a little bit. I want to keep some of the gaps. Perhaps I'll turn it down to the lowest part of 2%. Keep some of these sweeps and bands and not destroy the gaps. I want those to remain too. Again, part of describing the actual forms. A couple of shapes here. Move across. Again, continue to bring down some of these shapes. The meat down at the bottom. The peak here that perhaps we're just continuing to identify a little bit. Just some sweeps across once more. I'm going to put it up 3% size, and then just, yeah, when it comes lower down, I'm allowing it to soften in a little bit more, bind together a little bit more, like so. Not filling it in. I definitely want it to be patchy, bands of it with gaps. I think that's really important. Okay, I'm going to create another layer, layer 7, and we're going to go to our colors, and we're going to go for the 6 color along. I'm going to stay on the soft brush, down to the 2% size, maybe even further down to 30%. And then we're going to start introducing some green into this. Now it's quite strong actually, so let's put it down to 20%. And again, we're building in these sweeps. It's going to be flatter ground now. The base of the mountain area, we're going to have grass areas. The sun's going to hit it, so it's going to be quite vibrant for the most part. Most of the shadow that we've seen so far is because the mountain is making a big obstruction to the light, whereas down here, it's in front of the mountain, there's nothing obscuring it. So I'm just going to bring some bands of this all the way across. Again, keep it quite broken, retain some of the gaps. They are a really important feature. And once you've got that general sense of some bands of that green, we're going to stay on the same layer, but I'm going to go back to the first color on the middle row. I'm going to put the brush size to 1% size at the top end of 1% and about 50% opacity, and then just zoom in a little bit. And then as we come further down into here, I'm going to have some maybe collections of tree areas that just group together in a kind of band of trees that cut through some of this green and just create more texture. Perhaps we could even put that back up again to just into the 2%. Build these across. Could be larger shapes we could scribble in. Just build in, you know, it doesn't really matter about the way that you apply it. It could be dashes, dots, scribbles, doesn't really matter, as long as we're getting them in here. I'm going to do something that cuts in front over here, so it doesn't need to be much in that area. I'm going to turn it down even more, 30% or so, and then continue upward some of this texture. Go back to layer 7, and I'm going to go to this next color, which is the 7th color on the middle row. Still with the soft brush, 5% size now, 20% opacity, and then just in this bottom area, just bring this green down a little bit more. It's going to be covered, but I'm just bringing a bit more of this green into this lower area, like so. Okay, we're going to create a new layer, layer 7, and I'm going to go to my medium brush within airbrushing again. I'm going to go to the 8th color on the middle row. I'm going to put the brush size maybe to about 3% and 90% opacity. And I'm going to bring in some land, have it kind of risen up on this side slightly, and then bring it in here. Perhaps then I'll turn it down again, maybe quite low actually, 20% opacity maybe. Bring it into here, so this is lower in. Bring it in here, smooth it in. Maybe just extend that upwards a little bit over at this side, but not as much as on that side. I'm going to turn it down to 2%, and then just bring another streak of this in here as well. Again, some of these gaps and bands are an important feature. Allow some of those breaks to appear there, all part of the process. I'm going to turn it up, 5% size, and then I'm just going to allow that to build up over on this side. come down a little bit further. Turn it down even further, 10%. Bring some of it over onto this side. Then I'm going to go to the next colour, the 9th colour. Same brush, but reduce down to the lowest part of 2%, then back up to about 70% opacity. And then I'm just going to build in some darker areas of grass, trees, other organic matter just on that rise there, and then have it kind of just dissolve back out. Let's just make it a bit bigger, higher on the 2%, bring some of it in here as well. Turn it back down perhaps to 30% and just soften that in a little bit. And then we can go over to this side, start to bring some of these darker forms in over here. It's going to be a little bit lower than that, but let's just bring that in. Then I'm going to go to the end colour, which is a darker green. Bring the brush down to the lower part of 2% again, 80% opacity. And then I'm just going to carefully start building in some trees, things over here. Perhaps 80% is a little bit strong. 60 might do better. Just to work along that top edge, bring some features, things that are growing, bring them up this way as well. Then move over to this side. Again, we can build in some features, some trees. Perhaps we'll just slightly circular motion. We're going to be doing something similar to what we've got there in the distance. These are going to be even further away. Maybe I could turn the opacity down now, 30%. Have them kind of fading away a little bit. Soften them in. Maybe some splits in those shapes here, just other little elements to that too. Okay, I might add just a little bit more of a feature, a couple of trees. So I'm going to go to my brushes. I'm going to go to the artistic Aurora brush. I'm going to reset it first of all. Tap on the brush again. Go to the color dynamics. I'm going to change the hue, which is at 16%, put it to none. Just means that you won't get any variation in color. It will stay consistent. Turn it down to the lowest part of 2%, 100% opacity, why not? And then we can just get in there, just create a little bit of a kind of, some kind of pine tree, some kind of fir tree, and we can just push it left to right until we've created something there, maybe just another smaller one next to it. We don't want to leave it out there in isolation. Maybe just another little thing there as well. Then we can go backwards, color, and just on one side we can just tap in some of that texture on that edge. Remember where the light is coming from. Perhaps we ought to turn that down to a lower percentage though, so 20% or so, just to keep it a little bit more gradual, a bit more subtle. Something over on that side. Okay, so we've created a couple of trees there. I'm going to build in a nice rock feature on this side. Still on the same layer. We'll go in with the second colour on the bottom row. We'll go back to the airbrushing medium brush, put it at maybe 3% size and 90% opacity. And then we'll just build in a couple of rocks over here, like so. Turn it back down again, 2%. And then we'll just have it blend in here a little bit and trail off. Then I'm going to go backwards a colour, the first colour on the bottom row, turn it down to maybe 50% opacity, again low on the 2% size. I'm just going to build in light colour here. So we've got the same effect on this rock that we had on the distant mountain, except it's warmer, because when you get items that are closer to you, then you get warmer colours more generally. Create some little divides, some splits in the rock. Some of that texture is going to be important. Then I'm going to go to the third colour, still on the bottom row, zoom in just a little bit. Maybe we'll turn the brush size even further down into the 1%. And then in the shadow side, we don't want it to be completely flat, so we can just break it into sections of texture, so it's not completely featureless over on this side too. And you can always go back in with the first colour if you want to just continue to control those divides there as well. Find the balance that works, something like that. Back in with a warm colour, maybe just one or two extra points there along the top where it's still catching the light maybe. Yeah, I think that works. Now we're very much working more in the foreground areas now. So go back to my colors, got the fourth color on the bottom row. So I'm going to create a new layer for this. I'm going to go in with the soft brush within airbrushing. I'm going to go down to top end of 2% size, 20% opacity. And again, with the fourth color, I'm going to start building in some patches of this warmth in here as well. Come a little bit closer to us, lower down on the canvas. Perhaps I'll turn it down a little bit on the 2% actually. I tend to do a lot of the detail in my images at the lowest part of 2%. I find it's just a really nice point, sweet spot for the kind of level of detail. If I go right down to the bottom of the sizes, then you can barely see it at that percentage. But I just don't like the absolute thinness of the shapes then. Whereas we're up into the 2%, it's just about the right level. And like I say, we're just building in. Oops, that's too dark again, so let's put that back down. We'll try a little bit more than the 20, perhaps maybe 30. And just with some dashes. Now, because as the texture gets closer to us, we're going to see a little bit more kind of character to these textures. They're not going to be as flat. Building in some texture as I work across the landscape there. Just some dashes that are all generally sloped in the same direction. Now we're going to add blades of grass as we get closer to us. So this will add to the mix and help with that sense of grass maybe blowing in the wind. And just bring some of these streaks down like so. Back to my colors. It's going to stay on the same layer. I'm going to go for the fifth color. Same brush, slightly higher on the 2% size, 30% opacity again, and this color is getting even warmer. So we can just bring its influence even more. Try and get rid of any of that blue that might still be peeking through. Don't really want much of that showing anymore. So let's turn the brush size up for that 4%. We can really start to blot out any of that remaining blue. Zoom out if you need to just see that more clearly. I'm going to go to the sixth color. I may also stay on this same layer. I'm going to put the brush size on the soft brush up to maybe 3%, but quite low at only 20% opacity. And then just in this lower region, I'm going to start building in the green. We're going to have much more noticeable and standard colors for grass in this foreground area. Just circling it in initially, just to build in kind of irregularities in the ground. And then over on this side too. It's quite a low percentage, so you don't need to be too worried about it. It doesn't matter if you do get some of this band and some of the brush marks remaining. I honestly don't think it's a problem at this stage. I'm going to put the brush size up to maybe 10% and just get some of this green in here, go over it a few times. And I will introduce maybe a water feature, a little stream here, but I'm just going to go over all the blue, put it all in to begin with, like that. Okay, I'm going to go to my layers and create a new layer, layer 10. I'm going to go back in with the soft brush with an airbrushing, and I'm going to go to the seventh color on the bottom row. I'm going to put the brush size maybe at 10% size, 50% opacity, and just do some of this tone, allow it to double up, make a few sweeps of this, and then don't go too high up. I don't want too much of it in there, and I'm pressing really lightly there as we start to join some of that yellow orange. So I want it to kind of just all mix together there a little bit. I'm then going to turn the brush size back down to 2% and the opacity down to 20%. And yeah, I'm going to start building in more of these textures. In fact, what I could do at this point, which is a really useful brush, is go to the organic rainforest brush, which I'm going to reset, tap on it again, and it's the spacing that I want to change from 27% up to maybe about 60%, like that. And then with the same color, I'm going to go 4% size and maybe 60% opacity. And then I'm going to add some of this texture in here, just for this kind of middle distance. Press lightly as we get further up there. Then I'm going to turn it up 7%. I'm going to press a bit more in these areas, build in some more of that texture. Then I'm going to turn it down 2%, and in this distant area back here, just lightly grazing some of that, but not much. And generally it's just adding some nice textures in there, which kind of work. Stay on the same layer. I've got an even darker color, the 8th color. I'm going to put the brush size up at 7%, stay at 60% opacity, and I can start in this really lower part, building in some blobs, some textures, just to really contrast nicely in this bottom area, I think. I don't really want to take that too much up there though. Okay, go back to our layers and we're going to create another layer, layer 11. I'm going to go to airbrushing, medium brush, go to my colors. I'm going to use the first color on the middle row. I'm going to put the brush size 2% and about 50% opacity. And I'm going to go to roughly the center area, maybe just off center a little bit. And I'm going to start bringing in a line, cuts across, a little bit tilted down, but really not very much. Go to roughly where we have this kind of area here with the trees and greenery, and I'm going to bring it sharply back. And I'm going to take it wider of this line. I'm going to have it more going this way. Then I'm going to steer it back again. So about here, and then back again, all the way back into this region. Something approaching that anyway. Yours ends up a little bit different. It doesn't really matter too much. I'm then going to turn the size of the brush up a little bit, maybe 4%, keep it at the 50% opacity. And I'm just going to thicken this up, certainly as it comes closer to us. Angle it down here, so it's broader as it meets that corner. And it quickly starts to narrow up as we get here. 3% size. Maybe we can still have a little bit of thickness as it joins here. We're going to shut some of this area down with other colors anyway, so don't worry too much. 2% again, and just a little bit of that thickness as it comes into that area. And then we can allow it to trail off into a really thin line. Then I'm going to go back to my layers and create a new layer, layer 12. I'm going to stay with the medium brush within airbrushing, but I'm going to go back to my colors, and I'm going to use the color on the very end of the bottom row, 10th color. I'm going to put the brush size down to the lower part of 2% size and up about 60% opacity. And then just from the corner here, I'm just going to bring a thin line in, and then I'm going to start bringing some shapes upwards to create some kind of rock areas just at the kind of the bank of this area. And then obviously we need to just have a little bit of darkness here that runs alongside the underneath of that grass area. And then we can go over to this side, and again we'll just have it creeping into the edge here. As it comes in here, we can perhaps just have it broadening off a little bit, and then we can always go back into this area too, and again just underneath the green we can bring that in. And remember, all of this dark color is importantly on one layer, because we can go back in a minute and just lighten areas of it up. But for now we're going to go to the underneath this area. Maybe we could broaden the brush, top part of 2%, and then we'll just bring this in the bottom area there, and we're just giving some heft, some kind of volume to these areas. And again we could just bring in jutting shapes, rocks that are just sticking out amongst the grass along this bank of this river. And in this lower area, again, maybe 4%, we can just start to soften in that area a little bit too. 2% just to sharpen it up as it really trails off into the water there a little bit. So getting some sharp corners where it meets the water. Back up 3%, maybe we could just have some rock features in here, just cutting in and out of the grass, and then maybe some down in this foreground area too. Okay, they're not very well described yet, and that's absolutely fine, because we're going to go to that layer, tap on it, put on the alpha lock. I'm going to go back to my colors. I'm going to use the 8th color on the bottom row, 7% size, 15% opacity, and I'm just going to go over it, perhaps a bit more than 15, maybe 30% or so. just bring out some of the darkness as it comes closer to us. Then go back to my colours. I'm going to use the third colour on the bottom row, and as it gets back there, we can just have it becoming slightly more blue purple as it goes further back in that area. And that's instantly brought some kind of colour tonal perspective where the hue and the tone shifts a little bit the further away it goes. We can turn off the alpha lock. We can go back to our colours, and we can use perhaps the first colour on the bottom row. Perhaps we ought to change to something like the soft brush, low on the 2% size, only 20% opacity. And then over on this side, we can have some of those dark colours becoming kind of sandy areas that just bank upwards into the grass area. Maybe down here, we can just have some of this lighter colour. There's kind of sand in the water area, just on the bank. We have a slight gap between the water and the rocks, where there's kind of earth and sand and just lighter colours in the mix. And same up here to an extent, not too much. And maybe this area here is a little bit dark still, so we can just subdue it with these sandy colours, just blend them in. And we've got, you know, it's quite similar to the other colours we were using this colour anyway earlier on, so we can extend some of that up and across a little bit. There's absolutely no problem with that. Then I'm going to go to the 9th colour, which is similar but just even lighter. Perhaps I need to go back to the medium brush again with an airbrushing. Lower part on 2%, maybe 40% opacity. And we just need to think carefully now about creating some angular shapes that are just going to catch the light. So you can do some thin lines. So let's even go down to the 1%. Some thin lines that just catch the light. Maybe some flat surfaces on top that just reflect back some of that light as well. And then again, we can just create multiple kind of surface, top edges, some angular shapes. You can always turn the percentage of this down so it's a bit more subtle in places. 20%. Build it up more gradually if you feel that you're not entirely confident with this type of texture. So yeah, just trace around some of the top edges, create angles, create something that might look more convincingly like rock. Cut along these angles. Don't rush these stages. Take some time. Trace around that top edge with a thin line, then start to jut in with some angles, scribble in areas, and then just go around the edges, shoring up some of those angles. We're starting to create some sort of, you know, structures. Go back to our colours. Perhaps we could go to that third colour on the bottom row, and we can add some cooler secondary kind of light colours in here as well. So the shadow areas are not completely lifeless. And then we've got these areas here. So perhaps use this lighter colour just to add some texture in here too. Let it mingle a little bit with the sandy colours. Just create some interesting angular shapes. Quite haphazard will do too. Then back to the 9th colour. Still only at the 20% opacity. Really low on the, well, it's 1%. And maybe just in some areas it's catching the light here too. Just a few touches here and there. And it could be mainly in shadow. And just slim parts that are catching the light. Just move this over here. Oops, we've missed a section there. That does happen sometimes if you zoomed in a little bit too much. It's not a problem. We can go back. Let's check what layer we were on. It's fine, it's all on that layer. So we go back to this end colour and just add some more of this in here. Back to the 9th colour. Back down to 20% again or so. And then we can just, again, just bring out some of the highlights, top of some of these rock shapes that, you know, aren't specifically there, but just a few lines along top edges of what you can imagine is there anyway. And just the suggestion sometimes, just a few shapes, actually your imagination can fill in the blanks. Sometimes it's not necessary to go overboard with detail. Your imagination is pretty good at just filling in, I think, actually. So sometimes just don't agonize over things. It actually is quite a simple thing. Just create some thin shapes, catching the edge, and then some, there's going to be some flatter areas where it hits more light on it like that. And you can see we've kind of got a nice rock effect in some areas. And just do that until you're feeling that it's kind of working enough. Okay, so, in terms of zoomed out, I think that's starting to pull together pretty nicely, but we can take this even further. So we'll create a new layer, layer 13. We'll stay on the, well, actually, no, we'll go to the soft brush within airbrushing. We'll go to a light color again. So maybe this 5th color on the bottom row, 2% size, maybe 20% opacity. And well, I just want to build in some lighter tones here at the top. So make sure it's low on the 2%. And just to create some nice sun, it's just touching the grass, building those highlights in. So along that top edge of this shape here, we're just building some nice highlight, and then some up here as well. We can go over this with a darker tone just to create some variation as well. But certainly let's introduce some of this light first. I'm going to put it up high on the 2%. Let's bring it in from this side, have it joining here. Looks really quite nice. Really nice sunny kind of spring colors. Bring it down a bit more, starting to like that effect. And we should have more on this side too. So we can bring it in here. Leave some of the dark green underneath, but certainly start bringing it in. Don't need to be too neat about it. I'm adding it in kind of taps and kind of bold textures. Maybe turn it up 3% or so. Bring some of it in here as well. Because what I'm going to do now is I'm going to change brush. I'm going to go to the inking studio pen. I'm going to have it at 15% size and 30% opacity with this same green. And then I'm going to bring in some grass textures emerging out of these areas. So just change up the direction, create some nice curves. Have it kind of cutting in front of some of these rocks in some areas too. And it's just going to kind of blend everything together quite nicely. So bring some up here and then up here as well. Perhaps we need to do smaller shapes in this upper area. We could even turn the size of the brush down to 10%. It's not going to make a huge difference, but be a little bit thinner. Change up the direction a little bit though. Don't have it completely consistent. I mean, I suppose you could imagine wind cutting across and have it in roughly general trend of direction, but you definitely want to create some blades of grass that cut in front of each other and change the angle up. Otherwise it's going to look too uniform. So that's starting to pull together a little bit better. And we've got this section over here. Perhaps we could have things that are just jutting in from a section that we don't quite see, but we can see the grass. Something like that. And then higher up here too, just the top edge. Create some blades of grass. Keep remembering to change that direction up. And then a little bit further back as well, you can just add some in there. And you won't always see every part of it, but it's there in the mix. Shorter, not quite as tall, so you won't always see the top of it. You can just do some hints of it, jutting up there, not too much. Just a suggestion perhaps sometimes is enough. And then back there is going to be too far away anyway. And just do a few dashes up here in another section that is already probably too far away to notice much of it. That's fine. We're getting that nice suggestion of textures in there. Perhaps we could change green. So we could go for the 6th color, which is quite a few notes darker, but we can have that in the mix too. So let's turn the strength of that up perhaps to 40%. We can have a few blades of that grass cutting up from the bottom area too. Maybe have we got a darker green? Yeah, we have. Go for the one on the very end of the middle row. We're just changing and alternating some of these tones in there quite nicely, I think. And again, we can just add those in the mix. And up in these areas too, just have some darker blades of grass that just mixing in, and then zoom out, take a look. And if you want to go in with the smudge, set to maybe the soft brush with an airbrushing, 2% size, maybe 30% strength, and anywhere where it's just looking a little bit awkward, it's not quite gelling, then you can just go in and mush that in a little bit. It's become one of my favorite words for describing this, mushing things in, but it kind of describes the way I see it. You don't always need everything as crystal clear detail. Sometimes just smudging it in does the trick, especially where the blades of grass meet the ground. I think sometimes just Making that a little less defined helps. Another thing we can do with the grass is we can go to the adjustments, the perspective blur, put it down here, and then we can slide it across. Not too much, certainly about 10% is way too much, but 5% works, I think, even 6%. Deselect, and then you can just see that it's just taking it slightly out of focus on the peripheral, on the edges, and I think it just softens it in a little bit better. Okay, I'm going to go back to layer 11. I'm going to tap on it and put on the alpha lock. I'm going to go in with the soft brush with an airbrushing. I'm going to go for the second color on the middle row, 2% size, 50% opacity, and I'm just going to start building in some streaks of lighter color as it gets higher up there a little bit. I want there to be gaps and turbulence in the water, and I can build it down here a little bit too, but I definitely want it to be lighter as it gets up into this region. Let's go for something even lighter. Let's go for the third blue on the top row. I don't want it to be completely filled in, I want it to be broken. And then a few dashes, as long as we keep in the general trend of movement. I think that's important. And then try and aim it in this area, coming from the bank. Keep that general trend of movement, but yeah, maybe just at the bank it's a bit more broken. We're just starting to vary up the tone there. I think it looks more effective. Maybe we get down here, you can just have some visible streaks, something like this. We'd even get in there with darker colours, I suppose, as well. Go for the first blue on the top row. Maybe there's a bit more shadow in this area, I don't know. You can just vary it up, really. So we definitely want some light tones in there and some dark tones. We don't want it all completely consistent. Back with a lighter colour, maybe the fourth colour on the top row. 1% size. Lower on the opacity, maybe 30%. And yeah, along that kind of shore, not shore, sorry, the bank of the river, you know, the water breaks a little bit more and you can just have more turbulence here. So a little bit more of the white and up here as well. Just tapping it in. And I guess we can also have kind of rocks and features in the water. We don't need to have it completely lifeless. Just a few lighter colours down here before I move on to adding a couple of rocks, perhaps just thinner streaks of this. Maybe we can go into those sections with something like the second colour. 1% size still, yeah, and we can just add some little anomalies in the water. It doesn't all have to be featureless. Don't want to do too much of that kind of thing though, but just, yeah, suggestions of it here and there I think can really be quite nice. Just breaks it up a little bit. Let's move over to this section. We can add some of these darker streaks coming in from the bank, the river bank. Just some fine tuning details. Perhaps we could have some sense of rocks going off in the distance in the landscape. So what would we need to do? Well, we've got the alpha lock on that layer, so let's go up to layer 13 at the very top, and still with the second colour on the bottom row, still with the soft brush, 2% size, 30% opacity still. Whoops, trying not to add them where they're not wanted. And we could just have some rock features that just stick out in places in the landscape. You don't need to do too much of these kind of things, but it's quite nice to have just something. Bring some of it more up here, perhaps. Like so. I think that makes it a more interesting area. Just some back here. Just make it look nice and busy in different areas, I think. Let's have a look. Add some streaks in there, maybe. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to leave this tutorial here at this point. I hope you've enjoyed following along. There will be an extended version of this tutorial on my Patreon page in a couple of days. So if you are subscribed at the right tier level, then you'll be able to have access to that too. Otherwise, I'll see you back here on YouTube next Sunday. Thanks so much for watching. See you back here soon.